The Center for Global Justice is a multinational and bilingual research center in San Miguel de Allende, Mexico. Ser Mujer is an organization comprised of women of all ages from Mexico, Spain, Chile, Canada, and the United States. We're dedicated to honoring the struggles and successes of women around the world. We are grateful to the Center for their collaboration, the use of their Zoom account and YouTube channel, their staff, and their experience with online webinars. We are also grateful to the many people that made today's program possible, including Maritere Dubarganes, who was offering simultaneous translation. And thanks to Roberto Robles and Liz Mestres for their technical support. Due to the pandemic, the center has discontinued in-person events and instituted online webinars. Without their previous revenue-generating programs, the center depends on your donations to support these webinars to be able to continue to pay the Mexican staff. You can donate at the center's website, www.globaljusticecenter.org. Today's program is on Black women in the U.S. cooperative movement. Cooperatives have been a particularly important community and economic development tool in Black communities because of their economic and social benefits. The African American co-op movement parallels the long civil rights movement. In African American co-op history, many of the players are the same as those who became famous for their civil rights activities. Here to introduce our speaker is Cliff Durand with the Center for Global Justice.
Thank you, Trish. An important part of the history of cooperativism that is usually overlooked is the development of cooperative institutions and practices among African Americans. Emerging as defense against a hostile white world, this collective self-reliance was a way to survive. Now this story of the agency of a self-conscious people is chronicled in the book Collective Courage by Jessica Gordon Nemhart. She's researched the long story of cooperative Black business ownership, intentional communities, and mutual aid throughout U.S. history. As in so much of African American struggles, Black women have played a leading role. We're really delighted to have Jessica with us today. She is a professor of community justice and social economic development in the Department of Africana Studies at the John Jay College of the City University of New York. She will be happy to take your questions, and we'll have discussion following her presentation, but let me turn the floor over to Jessica now.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks, Cliff, for that. Thanks, Trish. Thanks, everybody, for having me. I'm going to share my screen. There we go. And I'm excited. This is Women's History Month in the US. And so I'm excited particularly to be able to share some of my research and learnings, especially about the role of Black women, African American women in the US cooperative movement. You can use the Q&A feature to ask questions and make comments, and we've got somebody monitoring that. I do want to start with thanks and acknowledgements. Oh, shoot, I have the wrong thanks on there. I'm so sorry. Thanks to the Center for Global Studies and Mujeres. I do want to acknowledge the original stewards of the land, do a land acknowledgement, remind us that we still suffer under colonialism and need control over land. I do want to acknowledge and invite into our space our ancestors, those enslaved, those who continue to labor without just compensation, those who have practiced resistance, those who have kind of shown us the way through their own self-reliance, through cooperative solidarity efforts. I want to recognize the struggles of all those combating racism, patriarchy, police brutality, acknowledge the movement for Black lives. And I also want to acknowledge our elders and bring them into this space in honor role. And of course, for this presentation, I want to honor some of the Black women leaders. I highlight some of the women who have been leaders in the US movement and also ended up with some leadership in other places, not just in Black spaces, but in the broader US co-op movement and sometimes internationally. But of course, we also should mention all the unsung heroes. But here is a quick list of some of the women I will mention some about and their co-ops. Ella Jo Baker, who was executive director of the Young Negroes Cooperative League in the 1930s. And I do have to remember to talk slowly because of the simultaneous translation. So sorry about that. I'll talk slower. Nannie Helen Burroughs, also from the 30s and 40s, who started a cooperative in Washington, D.C. Helena Wilson, less well known than the other two, with the Sleeping Car Porters, Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters in the 30s and 40s. Estelle Witherspoon from the 60s to the 90s in the Freedom Quilting Bee, which we'll talk about. Fannie Lou Hamer, from pig banking to Freedom Farm in the 1970s. Peggy Armstrong, one of the co-founders of the Cooperative Home Care Associates, which is currently the largest worker cooperative in the United States, and it's owned and run mostly by women. The Federation of Southern Cooperatives has strong Black women leadership: Melba Smith, Shirley Sherrod, Shirley Blakely, Alice Paris, Carol Zippert. And then also in the housing co-op movement, I mentioned Linda Leaks, Adra, and Zinga Ifateo, who I think has presented at the center in the past. So just to honor those women, I've got a couple of pictures. I'll go through them quickly. And we'll talk about Ujima Collective toward the end. They're a newer cooperative. So African American, as you've heard in the intros, have played integral part in the US Black cooperative movement. This is similar to their roles in the Black church and mutual aid societies and the civil rights movement around the world. You know, and often the ones doing the organizing, managing, but in the background doing a lot of the scud work, not much of the glory and not a lot of formal recognition. However, when I started doing research on Black co-ops in the US, I found that women weren't just members, they weren't just in the background, they were also founders, managers, directors, presidents of cooperative enterprises. They were often the backbone of cooperative education programs, often the one spearheading cooperative collective activity. And so I realized that this was part of the story that often we don't hear. A lot of the other cooperative movements in other countries have lamented about that there hasn't been a strong enough role for women. And so I was excited to find that I actually found a lot of leadership. And a lot of it started in mutual aid societies, which I'll talk about in a second, and then moved on to being involved in actual official cooperative economic projects, but very much doing the education about cooperative economics, helping to develop and helping to sustain co-ops. And now when we look at the contemporary worker co-op movement in the United States, we actually see women of color are actually very strong in that movement. And so I end with some of their contributions there. So we can talk about centuries of Black women's mutual aid, ways that women in general, but in my case, I'm focusing on African-American women, have sort of met vital social welfare needs. If you, you know, mutual aid is both a term and it's a sort of a verb and a noun, right? So as a verb, it's about how people help each other and support each other, pool resources together, but it's also a noun, meaning there are associations and societies where people come together to address a need and address that need by pooling resources. Usually people contribute monthly, either dues or a monthly stipend to a pot, a communal pot that then is used for very specific things like burial or sickness and health, usually around social needs, sometimes to create a school or do education, that kind of thing. And again, when we look through this history of mutual aid, pretty much all human beings, all populations engage in mutual aid. When I was studying African-American cooperatives, I found out that Black women, again, had a very strong influence and impact on mutual aid, and often were the ones starting mutual aid associations. By the early 1800s, some of the studies show that, a third to a half of the Black population were in mutual aid associations, and 3/4 of those had been started by Black women or were owned and run by Black women. And so that's why I talk about this centuries of Black women's mutual aid. We see the same thing now in the pandemic. Mutual aid has been growing again and again. We see women have asserted leadership and and promotion of mutual aid. And in the story of Black cooperative economics, we see that mutual aid was an integral to the transition to formal co-op and formal cooperative business ownership. And so let me just quickly mention what I mean by co-op business ownership and formal cooperatives. I'm talking about enterprises that are incorporated as under co-op law for whatever state or federal association that they're incorporated under, and incorporated in such a way that they honor the 7 international principles of cooperation, meaning democratic participation, so that decisions are made democratically. Everybody just has one member, one vote. So it's not how much money you put in or how much time you put into the business, but that you are a member, and one share, one activity, one contribution of equity makes you a member, and then every member has an equal vote. So that the democratic participation part is important, the joint ownership, everybody owning an enterprise together. Then there's other principles about returns to membership over returns to capital, things about giving back to community, education being important, because how can you do democratic economics if people don't have the same information and aren't educated about it, cooperation among co-ops, and autonomy and independence. So when I talk about co-ops, I talk broadly about collectives and businesses that are cooperatively owned, but I also talk specifically about businesses that were incorporated under co-op law according to those principles that I just mentioned. So my first example, I have a couple of examples of sort of mutual aid collectives throughout history to get us warmed up and to see, so you get some examples of what I'm talking about. And then I've got a few examples of African-American owned cooperatives, some of them owned and run by women, and some with just strong women participation. So the Combahee River Colony was a collective of Black women during the Civil War in the United States. Civil War was between 1860 and 1865. Eastern South Carolina in the Gullah Geechee communities was in part of the Confederacy, and during a liberation effort that was actually helped by Harriet Tubman. Some of you might know, she was a scout in the Union Army, but she's mostly known for having been what they call a general in the Underground Railroad, which was the social economic system that carried fugitives from slavery to freedom. But she was a Union Army scout at this time, and in this particular effort, she helped to liberate this area on the Combahee River in South Carolina. When the Combahee River was liberated by the Union troops burned down most of the plantation homes, ran the plantation owners out, and ran the Confederate Army out of the area. Many of the Black men joined the Union Army to fight against the Confederacy, leaving the women on these abandoned plantations. What did the women do? They stayed, and they changed their relationships so that they could, so that they farmed and took over these plantations, farmed them in collectives, made handicrafts as collectives, sold the produce, sold the handicrafts to make a living, kept the communities going, looked after the elderly and the children, and had a place, created their own homes, their own collectives out of this mess that the war had created. And so again, they were asserting the strength as both independent Black people, but also as women. So they refused to work for whites. They insisted on taking care of their own and remaining independent. and wouldn't really let other people come in and try to take over or make them a dependency. So a very early, interesting sort of model about both women's independence, women's assertions of themselves, and women's ability to handle their economic lives, and also an example of mutual aid and a collective activity. Another kind of mutual aid society is connected to the reparations movement. In fact, it's probably the first official organization demanding reparations for ex-slaves, called the Ex-Slave Pension Society. A Black woman named Callie House is one of the founders in 1896. And the organization called for past wages for ex-slaves, so being paid right back wages, being paid for the work that they weren't paid for, and that ex-slaves should have pensions. And they tried to get pension legislation through states and federal government, which basically would have been our first form of reparations if they had been successful. It was, sort of a lobbying and a political party in that sense, but it also was a mutual aid society. And it was the mutual aid society aspect of this organization that allowed it to actually last until 1931, even though the reparations political part was shorter lived. And so the women, again, came together, provided aid and relief to their members, collected dues in order to help pay for things and to help pay for the lobbying that they did. They continued to stay solvent because of the mutual aid aspect, the fact that people kept putting money in to do this. It was pretty much women-led as well as women-founded. However, Callie House gets persecuted just similar to the way Marcus Garvey had. She gets persecuted for mail fraud because it was a national movement. She requested dues payments through the mail, and they considered that mail fraud. And so she was persecuted and tried to be stopped, but the rest of the organization kept going, but they were not able to pursue their political legislation part. And then my last mutual aid example is Magdalena Walker and the Independent Order of St. Luke from the late 1800s to the mid 1900s. The Independent Order of St. Luke was a fraternal organization that also created mutual aid societies in different states. It started out as a women's sickness and death benefit association in Maryland in 1867. When Magdalena Walker became the Grand Secretary or the president of the organization in Virginia in 1899, she reorganized the organization. They actually started accepting men in the 1880s when they expanded to New York and Virginia. Walker consolidated the organization in Richmond, established a bank and a department store and an affordable housing program, all again with the basis of the Mutual Aid Association, but then these social enterprises that they engaged in also brought in money. By 1924, the Independent Order had over 50,000 members, 1,500 local chapters, and in the Richmond headquarters, there were 50 staff with assets of almost $400,000. The savings bank actually became a larger bank and one of the largest Black banks in the country. And so again, this connection between mutual aid, business development, women's leadership is all shown in this example. Walker was also what we guess now we would call a feminist. I don't think she called herself a feminist at the time, but she insisted, right, that women's roles be expanded economically and politically, and that it was essential, right, for the what we call the way for the race to expand and to get more power was this having women's role and having women's roles equal to men. That Black men couldn't achieve their full potential without women achieving their full potential. That's what she argued. And she argued that the only way for Black women to kind of make it through, to survive and thrive, would be to band ourselves together, to organize, right, to work together, brains, hands, and make businesses for ourselves. And so she was a very strong leader in sort of Black women's entrepreneurship as well as mutual aid and collective economics for the whole race. So interesting that she not only just ran a mutual aid association and all these other social enterprises, but also that she believed in the power of women's leadership. So let's move further up in history, and I have a little bit to talk about women's guilds and study groups. We have several examples where the women's guilds were really important in co-ed co-ops. So the women weren't necessarily the leaders of the co-op, but the women's guild was kind of the sort of backbone of the co-op movement. So one of the examples with the Consumer Cooperative Trading Company in Gary, Indiana in the 1930s, it was the Women's Guild that developed out of a study group. Well, the whole co-op started out of a study group, and then the Women's Guild was a subgroup of the study group. And they were responsible, the Women's Guild were responsible for really keeping the co-op education aspect going and for reinvigorating the co-op movement in Gary, because it had a bunch of fits and starts. So it started during the Great Depression. They realized the Black community in Gary, Indiana realized they needed to do something when the last bank left their community. They didn't have a gas station. They didn't have any food stores. So they organized themselves, studied cooperative economics, started a study group, which is actually the way that most of the Black co-ops I found started, with study groups. And then often these study groups were perpetuated by the Women's Guild or the women's aspect of it. In this case, after they studied for about 18 months, the Gary group started a grocery co-op, then a credit union, then a gas station, a co-op gas station, and then a second branch of the grocery co-op. And all of the men who talk about this project talk about how important the Women's Guild was and how important the women's energy and persistence was in keeping the organization going, keeping it moving to the next level, that kind of thing. So that's my example of sort of women's guilds and study circles. Then let's talk about Ella Jo Baker and the Young Negroes Cooperative League. So George Schuyler and Ella Jo Baker are the co-founders of the Young Negroes Cooperative League. George Schuyler was a Black journalist. He had a column in the Pittsburgh Courier in these days in the early 1930s, again during the Great Depression. And he put one of his columns, he put out a call to young Negroes to save the race by promoting economic cooperation and being engaged in cooperatives and economic cooperation. He and Baker founded the organization in December 1930 with about 25 to 30 African-American youth. Their goal was to keep control of the organization in the hands of young people, to bring women into the league on an equal basis as men, and to have Black youth be the ones that promoted cooperative economics, learned about it, taught other people how to do it, and started creating co-ops. In addition to the interesting point that this was youth-led and that the mission and vision of the organization was that Black life would be much better if we all were in co-ops together, as opposed to trying to battle it out in the capitalist sphere, but also that notion that young people and women needed to join forces, and that the stronger co-ops, the strongest alternative solutions would be through cooperative economics. But the third most important thing about the Young Negroes Cooperative League is most people know Ella Jo Baker because of what she did in the 50s and 60s. She was a field worker for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and went all around the South in the 50s, working with the NAACP on their legal strategy for desegregation and Black rights. She also was one of the co-founders of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Council, which is the organization that made Martin Luther King famous. He was the president and she was the executive director, which lots of people don't know. And then most people know about her because she was an advisor to the young Black people in the 60s to start SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Then later called the Student National Coordinating Committee. No, most people didn't realize that Baker started her career in the Young Negroes Cooperative League right out of college. And most of what we can see of her notions of grassroots organizing, the importance of youth leadership, democratic leadership, and economic justice really came out of her co-op roots. So if you look back through her life and look at what she was writing about and doing, she traveled all around the US with the Young Negroes Cooperative League, teaching people about cooperative economics, training people on how to start their own co-ops, and helping the co-ops that started to raise money and to stay in business. So another interesting kind of connection. That's why I keep talking about this connection between the civil rights movement and the co-op movement. A lot of these leaders, you know, cut their teeth in co-ops or were involved in co-ops, but were better known for their political rights movements. Helena Wilson, who's not well known at all, but was the first and longest running president of the Ladies Auxiliary to the first independent Black union called the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. That was organized by A. Philip Randolph, who also is a quite well-known civil rights leader. But again, we don't know that much about Helena Wilson, who was in the background as the head of the Ladies Auxiliary, and she did a lot of education in the Brotherhood Union about co-ops, co-op development, consumer rights, and you'll see in a minute I have a slide about all the things she did. But she promoted co-ops among union members and that connection of using good union wages, making sure they kept recirculating in the community. So the first thing in 1938, which is about a year or so after the Brotherhood organized, she and A. Philip Randolph put together what they called instructions and decisions for the auxiliary, the women, and for the men who were mostly in the union, and had all the families subscribing to journals and newsletters about consumer economics and cooperatives, studying credit unions and consumer cooperation, with a mind to thinking about how they could keep recirculating good union dollars into the community and keep doing things, creating other co-ops and things, so that the money would go back into the Black community and wouldn't go out into other places. So she helped them to start a buying club in Chicago. She wrote about all this work. She wrote about co-op principles. She wrote about what co-ops were, and she wrote about the progress they made. So in 1947, when she talked about the Cooperative Buying Club, she talked about how it's the first group of Negro women connected with labor to initiate a consumer cooperative enterprise. So she was very conscious of her connection to the labor movement and her connection to the cooperative movement, and very conscious that she was connecting these movements, right? And then also very conscious that she was leading Black women to do this background work while the husbands were having these good union jobs, and talking about how union labor, right? It wasn't just enough to have good union jobs. It was important to what we do with that money, right? The other thing that she helped to spearhead was credit unions, and actually the first credit union that was started by a chapter of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters was in Montreal, because if you don't know, the sleeping car porters were in Canada and the US. I'm not sure if they were in Mexico, but they were pretty much wherever the sleeping cars went, the porters had chapters. And so their first credit union was Walker Credit Union in Montreal. And it was also, again, the importance of a credit union for Black union families was what to do with your savings, to make sure you had good financial education, and that your savings went into an organization that would reuse it in the Black community, reuse it for other Black people, for other union people. And she thought it was very important. Remember, the union gets started during the New Deal. It was very important that union members understand, right, how to adjust to economic crises, how to use savings and budgeting, and the credit union was a good project to help people with that kind of financial education, in addition to support for community. Chateauver, who's one of the scholars who wrote about the Ladies Auxiliary, talked about how they also politicized the spending habits of union women and were able to raise members' living standards because they created more co-ops, they taught people about buymanship and consumer issues. And so they were able to keep that union money not just recirculating in the Black community, but used in a better way. And that Wilson continued to, like her 30 years as president of this organization, to promote consumers' cooperation, attending co-op meetings, having co-op study groups, starting cooperatives among all the Brotherhood chapters, sometimes successful, not always, but continue, she never kind of relented on that. And luckily she actually had a Philip Randolph's support, who was president of the Brotherhood for most of this time. So they actually kind of worked together on this. And I just wanted to give you a quote from her because you can see how she was thinking. She said, "No race can be said to be another's equal that cannot or will not protect its own interests. This new order can be brought about once a Negro acknowledges the wisdom in uniting his forces and pooling his funds for the common good of all." And of course, now we wouldn't say his, we'd say theirs or humankind or something. But remember, this was what she wrote this in like 1940 or something. But the idea is, right, pooling our funds for the common good for all, and that we realize we have to protect our own interests, right? This is all about that self-help, self-reliance, and using mutual aid and cooperation. Helena Wilson actually started her career as the head of a mutual aid association, then got, her husband got in the union, she got in the union, and then became, as I said, for 30 years, the president of the Ladies Auxiliary, and giving this kind of leadership throughout that period. Fast forward to the 60s, I'm almost done so that we can open it up to a discussion. I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of the variety of ways that Black women have been involved in the co-op movement and supported the themes and theories and ideas about how to use cooperatives for community development. Freedom Quilting Bee is a founding member of the Federation of Southern Cooperatives Land Assistance Fund, which continues to exist now. It was started in 1967 by sharecropping women to sell their quilts for extra money. If you know about sharecropping, that's when families rented land. Often it was in the South, Blacks renting land from former slave owners and former plantation owners in order to make a living. But basically it's debt peonage because they usually started out renting land without any money down. They put their crops up, right, as collateral. The landowner also buys your crops from you and decides how much the crops are worth. The landowner also advances you the money for seeds and tractors and that kind of thing. So you're totally indebted to the landowner. And then if they're deciding how much the crop is worth at the end, they decide whether you get out of debt or not. And most of the time you just continue to be in debt. And then if there was a bad year, you'd be in more debt. And so the women, actually, it was a priest who gave them the idea that he could sell some of their quilts in the North. They could get some extra money. He did that, brought them back the extra money, which they then used to start a quilting cooperative. First, they started sewing quilts in their own homes in the winter when they weren't planting and harvesting. But they slowly developed, the co-op developed into sort of its own business of its own. They made enough money to buy land and build a sewing factory. Once they were not working from home, they needed something to do with their children. So they also created a community childcare center, an after-school program, summer reading programs, so that the co-op expanded to not just, right, being some extra income for the women to do something with their creativity, but really a whole community business. Estelle Witherspoon is one of the founders, one of the quilters that founded it. The other thing that having the 23 acres of land that they bought did for them, in addition to creating sort of this social enterprise and co-op business and the childcare program, they also then, they had extra land. And so they were able to actually help other sharecroppers. Some got evicted for registering to vote. This is the 1960s and early 70s when there's a lot of civil rights activity. And one of the main activities was registering Blacks to vote, to use their right to vote and to getting over the barriers that some governments had put up to voting. But a lot of the landowners would evict you if you registered to vote or went to a civil rights meeting or participated in a demonstration. And so again, you're not only in debt, but then you have no land. So the fact that the co-op owned land enabled them to actually lease to other former sharecroppers, and sometimes they sold a couple of acres to former sharecroppers. So again, the co-op is helping with childcare, it's helping with land ownership issues, creating that independent Black business that then can do a lot of other community things. At its height in the 1990s, it had 150 members, was the largest employer in the town of Alberta, Alabama. It went through some hiatus and is still kind of alive, but has never been back to that height of 150 members. Workers Own Sewing Company, another sewing example in the 70s and 80s, founded by 5 seamstresses and a farmer in Windsor, North Carolina. These were machine operators who were heads of households who were seamstresses in a sewing factory. They wanted to provide for themselves and other Black industrial seamstresses with steady jobs, especially as the textile industry was declining in North Carolina. And once the owner was selling the property, they decided to buy it and start a co-op so that they could both provide more steady work, more control. The women sewers could be in control of the business, and they could pay themselves better. They started out just as subcontractors and doing informal recruiting of sewers, as well as getting jobs informally through churches and civic groups. But they realized the subcontracting didn't really give them the kind of control they wanted. They realized they were better off submitting direct contracts on their own. And so starting in 1983, they did their own subcontracting. That enabled them to double their sales in the first year. They put in wage solidarity principles, so no one could make more than three times what the lowest paid person did. They also created an innovative bonus compensation policy for people who were more effective, more productive workers. And again, they ended up with a very successful sewing factory that was a co-op and run by the women who were running the machines and doing the sewing. And finally, Cooperative Home Care Associates started with Peggy Armstrong and some others in New York City, in the Bronx, South Bronx, actually, in the 1980s. It's a worker-owned home health care cooperative started by a social service agency that was looking to how do you create decent jobs in very low-skilled jobs and in a community, in that case, the Bronx, which is very low income and impoverished community. Their first years, over 75% of the employee owners, the women home care workers that became members of the co-op, had previously been dependent on public assistance. Even though they were home care paraprofessionals, they weren't making enough money and didn't have regular enough jobs, so they were also on public assistance. And the mission of Cooperative Home Care Associates was to create decent jobs by also training people to create, to do high level work, right? Even in a quote unquote unskilled industry, and to compensate both the clients and the workers as well as you possibly could. So they took previously unskilled women, especially Latina and African American women. They created a nonprofit training subsidiary so that they could train the women to the highest possible caliber that they could, to then justify paying living wages and state-of-the-art training. They now lead their industry in above average wages, benefits, career ladder opportunities, leadership training, and very low turnover. They're also their member owners are able to get actual full-time work, right? In addition to benefits, in addition to leading, right? Their training association trains you first in home care, then nursing aide, nurse, 3 levels of nursing, and they also do some training so you can move up into the management positions in the co-op. It is, I think I mentioned this earlier, the largest US worker cooperative, almost 2,000 employees, 70% of them are owners, and mostly Latina and African American women worker owners. So another very interesting model for how women's leadership and women's membership in co-ops can make a difference. The other thing that was very interesting in this model is their policy advocacy. at the state and city levels to increase the Medicare allocations, which is often what people use to pay for home care, so that if they increase the Medicare allocations for the city and for the state, then their wages would be competitive because they were charging living wages where most places don't. But if they were able to raise the wage, then their living wages aren't as far as, so there's not such a big gap between their wages and what the average wages are. And so that was a policy. They also were able to do advocacy to get more allocations for disabled people. And they actually started a separate subsidiary specifically for disabled home care for disabled people. And so they ended up specializing as another way to grow the co-op. And finally, cooperative home care also does wealth creation. Initial equity investment is $1,000, which you can pay off in installments through your paycheck. But they've been averaging, in the last 25 years, they've been averaging about a 25% annual dividend back to the members on your initial equity. So basically over 4 years, you made back what you had to pay into the co-op, and you continue to get good wages, benefits, and your dividend. They also help to bank the unbanked by creating direct deposit accounts for all their members. They have retirement accounts for all the member owners, and IDA, which are individual development accounts. These are matched savings accounts that they work on through their financial institution. And the members of Cooperative Home Care are also unionized. They're part of one of the major unions in New York City. And the union is actually what helps the co-op to be able to afford and give health care and some other benefits because of their union membership and because they're a member of a large union. So a really interesting model again. Oh, I forgot about Ujamaa. So finally, Ujamaa Collective and Marketplace in Pittsburgh. I'll go do that quickly because I think I'm running out of time. Started by 15 African-American women who wanted to organize a cooperative artists marketplace in the Hill District, which is the Black district of Pittsburgh, starting in 2007. These were cooperative artists who were also involved. They wanted to do green entrepreneurship and green business development in addition to doing jewelry, handmade jewelry, body care, organic produce, vegan, vegetarian foods, crafts, bags, but they didn't have a place to sell their work. They all were working out of their homes and doing what we call pop-ups, right? During holiday times, especially Thanksgiving and Christmas times, they would just have a marketplace pop up wherever they could find space or get cheap space or whatever. Sometimes they would do it together, but most of the time, each of these women had to find their own space. So they decided they needed a collective marketplace where they could do their work and sell their work in a stable place that they could afford. And so they came together to collectively own a physical marketplace. Then they could provide fair and consistent marketing to reach their customers. They would have a place, and they wouldn't have to keep moving around and work from home, that kind of thing. So they created this collective, which now does that. They were able to buy a space and work on it together. Their other mission are to teach women entrepreneurship classes to overcome non-traditional approaches to economic and racial disparities in Pittsburgh and to support sort of social entrepreneurship, co-op development, and women's leadership in that. I think I said all this. So they want to embrace cultural, historic uniqueness, provide safe and healthy intergenerational community space, which they were able to do, establish a process for women to learn money management, and in general, increase the net worth of Black women in our communities. So those are their missions, and you see they were able, again, to do it through a collective. So again, we see, all kinds of different businesses that women have been in the leadership of, that women have been owners of, that women have facilitated the development of. And finally, if you look at what's happening in the US worker co-op movement, you see that again, women of color are kind of leading the development in that movement. Most of the growth in the worker co-op movement in the last 10, 15, 20 years has been women of color owned worker cooperatives. And these businesses are emerging in healthcare, home care, childcare, home cleaning, catering, food services. They're founded and owned by women of color. They're leading their sectors and changing the nature of work for women, and they're increasing the returns to work with living wage jobs, multiple benefits, economic and non-economic benefits, and providing leadership and leadership development opportunities for women in addition to economic democracy. Thank you very much.
Well, now the floor is open for questions. And Laura will be relaying questions that have come in via the chat box. Has anything come in yet, Laura?
There are no questions at this point.
Oh my gosh. Okay.
Well, let me start off with a question then.
I'm sure Cliff has one, right?
Right. One of the things that I learned from reading your book was that W.E.B. Du Bois had written early on cooperatives. I had not realized that. I always thought of Du Bois' contribution as primarily in the political sphere and founding the NAA and its promotion of legal strategies. And Du Bois was usually counterpoised to the approach of Booker T. Washington, who was the one who was advocating Black-owned enterprises. But what was, are they really as opposed to each other as I have generally seen them portrayed?
No, and actually in his 1940 autobiography, Du Bois even says that. He says there was not a huge difference between him and Booker T. Washington. People made a big deal of it. He said his only real complaint against Booker T. Washington was that Booker T. relied too much on white philanthropy instead of trying, and so therefore he was beholden to how whites wanted the message to be and what whites wanted to happen. So that was his real, but not, but that he didn't actually disagree with him on the dignity of labor and the importance of us learning both how to do things for ourselves as well as how to think. Because if you look at the Tuskegee Institute, which Booker T. Washington created, the students not only studied, could go all the way to PhD and could get a good education, but they also helped to build the buildings. They made the bricks that built some of the buildings. They learned agriculture. So Booker T, his message got to be that we just should, start where we are and not expect much. But his real message was about the dignity of labor and how important it was to be intellectual, right? To be smart laborers and to use our intellect in whatever ways we needed to. Du Bois was much more about cooperative ownership, but he definitely believed in, this sort of self-help, own your own business kind of stuff. From the late 1880s, Du Bois was writing about, I think the first book was called Some Efforts Among Blacks for Enterprise or something. And while he was trying to document both the business development that Blacks were doing, he was also documenting the mutual aid and the cooperative activities that Blacks were engaged in. And then in 1907, he held a conference in Atlanta, at Atlanta University, and wrote a book called Economic Cooperation Among Negro Americans. And there he totally chronicles everything he could find from 1700s to 1907, mutual aid and economic cooperatives that Blacks were involved in. And he actually was the one who got me thinking more about mutual aid, not just co-op business ownership. And he said economic cooperation because he was looking not just at formally incorporated co-ops, but any kind of economic cooperation. So he looked at a range from mutual aid to even some joint stock ownership to full co-op ownership and economic democracy. And he's got some fabulous quotes from the early 1900s to like the 1930s and 40s about how economic cooperation is what would really liberate Black people, right? That we shouldn't try to be little capitalists or whatever, because that's not going to help the whole community. But if we really wanted to, liberate ourselves and be create the best societies we can, then we really need to use co-ops and economic cooperation, and that would be what would make us the strongest that we could possibly be. And so he started the Negro Cooperative Guild in 1918, trying to help Blacks to learn about co-ops and start co-ops. He wrote about co-ops in the Crisis magazine, which is the magazine of the NAACP. But again, he's another one of those leaders who most people didn't pay attention to the economic agenda. They only, they quote him and talk about all the other things, as you said, the politics and even the education position he had, but they don't talk about his economic position. And unfortunately, some of what I learned was we didn't talk about the economics, and especially not economic democracy and co-ops and stuff, because it was actually even more dangerous than talking about the political stuff. So people got silenced, co-ops got burned down, people got blacklisted if you talk too much about cooperative economics. So in some ways, even though people also got beaten and killed and lost land for trying to register to vote, it was actually easier to talk about political civil rights than it was to talk about economic rights and economic justice.
There are two questions here. One is, if one wanted to start a co-op, where to start?
Okay, well, that's actually an easy question. I know it sounds hard, but it's easy because the very first thing to do is to find other people who are interested or want to solve the same problem you're trying to solve and talk together. I think I sort of mentioned it quickly in one of the slides, but of all the, I don't know what it is, 200 and something co-ops that I was able to find something about and mention in my book, the majority of them were started with a study group. Meaning people came together, said, oh, hey, let's talk about this, right? The best example was that the Gary group, which I can't, for some reason I've forgotten their name now, Consumer Cooperative Trading Company in Gary, Indiana. They came together because, as I said, their last bank closed in their neighborhood, and it was the height of the Great Depression. They didn't know what to do. And they said, okay, let's think about, let's see, what have other people done? What are our options? They started reading and looking around. They came upon the co-op model. They liked it. They actually put a night school course in the Black high school so that people could actually take a course in cooperative economics. They met weekly. The Women's Guild started meeting weekly. They figured out that they wanted to start with food security. So they did a buying club that then became a grocery co-op. They then said, okay, we need a credit union. So then they, learned how to do that. So really coming together, talking about what are the issues, what are the problems, and then what's the model, and then learning about the model. And the learning together also creates a sense of solidarity and trust that you're going to need to run the co-op once you actually open the co-op. And so I say to people, even now during the pandemic, you can talk on the phone, talk by video chat, right? Just get together, read things together, talk about the issues, talk about the models you're thinking about. I was studying a co-op that started in a prison in Puerto Rico in 2012, was it? And that's the same thing. They realized that they wanted to start selling their artists, prison artists. They realized they wanted to start selling their artwork. They came together to talk about what would that look like. They realized that the way they made their art and the kind of business they wanted connected with co-op businesses. They demanded from their warden that the warden bring them a co-op educator. The Cooperative League of Cooperatives in Puerto Rico actually donated the services of one of their educators who came in and taught them about cooperative economics and how to start their own co-ops. When they went to Incorporated, they found out that Puerto Rican law doesn't allow incarcerated people to be members. So then they were able to get a meeting with the governor at that time, who then told them how to connect with the state assembly to get the law changed, and they got the law changed, and they incorporated as a co-op. So again, it just starts with people coming together, talking about it, studying together, finding out who can help them more, bringing those people in, and just continuing to learn together and study together. If you're in the United States, there's actually lots of co-op development groups now and co-op lawyers, Black and white, who can help you with the final steps. But it's really just about organizing. The first steps are organizing, bringing people together to talk and study.
And
And that's why women have been so strong in this movement, because that's what we do all the time, right? We're always organizing, bringing people together, creating relationships, learning together. And so I think that's one of the reasons why this model has resonated so much for Black women, because it's something we already do.
And Trish says, we lived in Wilmington, North Carolina, where there was a major white backlash in 1898. Has there been much backlash to the cooperative movement in the US?
Yes. There's the whole gamut of what I call sabotage. And I chronicle some of it in the book also, because that's an important part of the story. But the other important part of the story is how we fortified ourselves against that. But let me just talk about, so the gamut of sort of sabotage is, you know, from financial sabotage to actual white supremacist terrorism, lynching and killing leaders and burning down co-op buildings. And then the middle level would be that, remember I mentioned with Callie House, the actual state violence against her being fined for mail fraud for trying to create the co-op that she created. So there have been lots of examples. You know, the financial sabotage is the easiest one, where actual banks in a community would collude to not loan to a co-op, right? Or co-op farms, which couldn't get good loans even from the US government to stay in business. So there's that sort of level. There was a taxi cab co-op in Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the 70s. The sabotage against them was the insurance company. Once they saw that these cabs were willing to go into the Black communities, they tripled the insurance premiums and the co-op couldn't afford them. And so the co-op went under for that reason. Rent, a lot of the co-ops get sabotaged. The landowners increase the rent so high that the co-op can't stay in business. What else? And then you've got the real sabotage. New Communities Co-op in Georgia in the 80s and 90s. People were poisoning their wells. They also couldn't get a loan and got foreclosed on. People were smearing their name. You know, back in the 1800s, the whites stopped the white co-op from sharing a co-op with the Blacks through vigilante violence, and then accused one of the Black co-opers of raping a white woman, and so then sent in the militias and the posses, the vigilantes, to lynch him and all the co-op members, and then close down the co-op building. So there's a whole range. I've also written an article on why we should expand the call for reparations in because of all the sabotage against co-ops, Black co-ops, is another reason why we need reparations and a reparations movement. But the reparations could be used to do more co-op development, have more co-op funds and more co-op education. But there's that whole history. But then the other side of the story is the communities that came to support the co-ops, right? I also found that the co-ops survived the best when communities understood what they were doing, felt that the co-op was a part of them, and supported them, either, you know, running the vigilantes out of town, or rebuilding after the co-op has been destroyed, or patronizing the co-op to make sure the co-op has enough clients, raising money to help the co-op, you know, donating to the co-op. So there's lots of ways that community activity and community support. And then the biggest support I found for Black co-ops was the existence of Black organizations that supported co-op development and tried to do co-op financing. So having Black organizations that said, we understand co-op development, we want to support co-op development, was also really important to making these last. But some of the stories are really sad and the co-ops don't last long, but the learnings and the leadership that gets developed out of creating a co-op last. And the people who were involved in one co-op go on and do other similar kinds of things, and keep the ideas alive, even when the co-ops are are disbanded or are forced to stop. So it's kind of there's the good side, there's the good part of the story and the sad part of the story.
Well, I don't think there are any more questions at this point, Jessica. So,
Well, I have another one.
oh, wonderful.
Okay. One of the current cooperatives that is often touted and that a former colleague of yours, Gar Alprovitz, was involved in founding is in Cleveland, actually a network of cooperatives. Can you tell us something about that and the role of African Americans in forming and working in them?
Right. So that's another story that has, good and bad parts, right? So there's some frustrating parts of that story and some really exciting parts of that story. So, the exciting parts of that story are, that they got a lot of philanthropic money to do this network of worker co-ops in a city that needed co-op development, and that they tried to target some of that co-op development to the Black community. They used a model called anchor institutions model, where you get universities, and especially in this case, the Cleveland Hospital. I guess it's one of the hospitals. I think it's a Cleveland Hospital. And the notion there was you already have sort of nonprofit organizations that are doing things in communities and are going to be there to stay. What if you connected worker co-ops to them? So what services do they need? And in the case of the hospital, they need laundry service, they need food, that kind of thing. So how can you get this anchor institution to procure from the worker co-op? And then it has sort of a guaranteed income, a guaranteed clientele, and that can stabilize the co-op. So that's, that model is really exciting. We've seen it actually in other places. I saw there's a shoe co-op in Puerto Rico that their anchor institution was actually the police department. So their main client was providing shoes for the police department. That kept the co-op, the worker co-op alive, but then they also made other kinds of shoes and, but that stabilized them. So that anchor institution model is exciting. It probably could be done more. We're trying in New York City to get the city to actually agree to procure like 10 or 15%, to do 10 or 15% of its procurement from worker co-ops in New York City, that kind of thing. Unfortunately, what happened with the Cleveland model, though, was it was a very top-down model. So it was created outside of the community. It didn't really connect with what was happening in the community. It didn't connect with other Black organizations. And so even though a lot of the people who were hired for the worker co-ops were Blacks, they were hired and then taught how to run the business and then taught how to be a co-op member. And you can't really separate those things, right? They weren't, it wasn't sort of a grassroots movement, connected to other stuff the Black community was trying to do. It was something dropped in and then people were added, but they weren't added with that sense of ownership, especially because the philanthropy, often because they put so much money in, they often had already made certain decisions about certain things, so that even when you had the staff, the worker owners helping to participate in some of the decision making, there were a lot of decisions were already pre-made, so they didn't really have that sense of ownership or economic democracy. So it's a mixed bag. I mean, on the one hand, they are worker co-ops and we're happy, right, to have them. And as I said, the model makes a lot of sense, but some of the execution, especially from the perspective of people of color and Black people in Cleveland, the execution wasn't done as well as it could have done. And I think they've been learning lessons and writing more about what they're learning and how they're changing. I haven't really kept up with them lately, so I'm not sure what they're doing now or how much they've been able to address those initial weaknesses. But, at least 3 of the companies are still in business and that kind of thing. So one of the things I try to do is not be too critical of anything that at least keeps the principles of cooperatives and stuff going, but I try to also see what lessons can we learn so that these efforts can actually help people of color even more than they're doing, and can actually create leadership for people of color. So I don't know, did that answer your question, Cliff?
Yes, that's much more extensive than I've generally been able to find out about the Cleveland cooperatives. So that's very helpful. Thank
Yeah,
you.
there's been some stuff written, and GEO, Grassroots Economic Organizing, geo.coop. We've had some coverage of it. So there's some articles in there about it. And then I know some places, a couple of the Canadian PhD programs and co-ops have been studying it. And I think the Democracy Collaborative has put out a couple of its own studies about it. And then there's been some, some other replications of it that are try to learn lessons and replicate it differently. So what is it? Springfield, Massachusetts has a similar model. Trying to remember who else. So yeah, so I don't know exactly where to tell you specifically to get more information, but as I said, definitely GEO has a couple of articles, and I think there's some other studies out there.
You might explain for our listeners what GEO is.
Yeah, well, some of the founders of Center for Global Justice are also and were GEO members. Grassroots Economic Organizing is a group in the US, or I guess a collective nonprofit that puts out an online newsletter about worker ownership, worker co-ops in particular, and the solidarity economy. We used to have a print issue that came out quarterly. Now we have a pretty dynamic website, actually, that comes out at least weekly with new articles. We also do what's called gleanings, bring articles that were published somewhere else to people's attention. And we have tried to cover sort of the worker co-op movement in the US and made sure to be a voice for worker owners, as well as to be sort of the conscience of the worker co-op movement and put the sort of solidarity economic values onto the worker co-op movement and the worker ownership movement, so that we're looking to make sure that co-ops are really, a diverse, grassroots, really democratic, that kind of thing. So geo.coop is our website, and we have a lot of interesting articles on that. We also co-started a group called ed.coop, ed.coop, as a place to find more information about how to start co-ops, education and research about co-ops. And it's sort of a clearinghouse, so you can go on there and find a lot of other websites, which will lead you directly to governance issues, startup issues, finance issues, Co-op 101 programs, that kind of stuff. We did that with the Association of Cooperative Educators and TESA, Toolbox for Social Action, something like that. No, I don't know where the E goes. Toolbox for Education for Social Action. I think that's what TESA is. So anyway, ed.coop if you're looking for educational materials, and then geo.coop for general discussion about solidarity economics and worker ownership. Thanks for letting me do that plug, Cliff.
Yeah, well, those are resources that people need to know about, because we have a number of people in San Miguel who've been quite interested in learning on cooperatives. So they will appreciate that.
Yeah, and Bob Stone and Betsy Bowman are members of GEO, and were very active members of GEO before they moved down to San Miguel.
Right. Distinct from the anchor institution initiated cooperatives, more grassroots approach is in Jackson, Mississippi. What can you tell us about the cooperative movement there?
Yeah, so that one, I don't know the most recent stuff, but I know how they started and what their sort of mission and vision is. So that one was actually, instead of anchor institutions, the idea for the Jackson one was to take control over the city council and the mayor, which they managed to do with the election of the first mayor, Chokwe Lumumba. I don't know, what is that, 10 years ago or something? But unfortunately, he died after 2 years in office, and it took them another 4 to 6 years to get his son elected. But meanwhile, they had, and the purpose was to create like a whole co-op commonwealth in the city and county of Jackson. And so the mayor was going to lead a whole set of massive co-op education programs and co-op development programs. His plan was to try to convert some of the city-owned businesses to worker co-ops and consumer co-ops. And so in that sense, to create a whole cooperative commonwealth in Jackson. What he was able to do was they were able to start a group called Cooperation Jackson, which tried to do both get policies established and set in the city, but also to do co-op ownership. They managed to acquire some properties and do a lot of urban agriculture. Their plan was to also have some co-op cafes, a co-op education center, some co-op housing, and then they still were planning to try to see if they could convert the garbage and recycling in the city to a co-op. I'm not sure that they ever succeeded with that. And then once they got Chokwe Lumumba II or Jr. Into the mayorship, they had a little bit more foothold in the politics legislation side. But it's been a slow, what I can mostly say now, as I said, I haven't kept up in the last couple of years, but it's been a very slow process. They haven't gotten nearly as many worker co-ops as they wanted done. I think one of their problems is because they never were able to get that massive co-op education off the ground, that a lot of people have liked the idea of starting a co-op, but haven't had enough training about it. So I think at some point they probably have to focus back on doing more massive co-op education for how to start and run a co-op and that kind of thing. But again, a beautiful mission, a great idea. And that one is also a little bit top down in the sense of trying to see if you can get control of the government, the municipal government, to then do something, but they also have some grassroots activities in terms of Cooperation Jackson is kind of run by a group of grassroots people. So an interesting combination that way, and an interesting idea. I think people are trying to do that on a smaller level, right? There's a group in Georgia who just purchased some land and they're trying to start their own town based on cooperative economics. They got a little bit of media attention when they first bought the property and put out their plan. So, and then there's other cities which don't have that, you know, they don't have a mayor that ran on a co-op platform, but they definitely have a strong city council that's putting money into co-op development, especially worker co-op development. So that would be New York City, actually, Madison, Wisconsin, Richmond, California, a couple other cities. One of my colleagues did a study and said there's like 10 cities that are doing this in varying degrees, but putting actual money into co-op initiatives and co-op development, co-op education, financial opportunities, that kind of thing. So there's growing movements in the US to try, especially to try to get worker co-ops more on the table as a viable community development strategy. So that's really interesting to follow.
What do you think the federal government could do to help promote the development of cooperatives? You know, either through existing programs and agencies or through new legislation.
Right. Well, there's a couple things. The co-op movement is trying to get what we call unified co-op laws. Again, I don't know how much people know about the US, but in the US right now, to incorporate as a co-op, the laws are by state. So in every state, some states have almost no co-op laws or only for credit unions and agriculture co-ops. And then some states have very good, extensive co-op laws for any kind of co-op. So there's one of the movements is to try to have a unified federal law rather than to depend state by state on the laws. So that's one piece. Also right now with COVID and stuff, there's been a lot of energy just to make sure that all the supports for businesses, right, small business supports also include co-op businesses. And then my personal feeling is again, I really believe we need education and finances to go to understand co-ops and to go toward co-ops. So the recent piece I wrote about reparations, I believe we should get financial reparations, but I think some of them, a good substantial amount of the financial reparations should go into pots of money, federal, state, and municipal, that create co-op education opportunities and programs and co-op loan funds, very non-extractive co-op loan funds. So I do think it would be good to use, tax money, to use public money to help create more credit unions, to help create worker co-ops, co-ops in every structure, in every kind of co-op, in every industry. And I think the way to do that is that we have to start with education, and then we have to make sure there's money to help people with the startup, right? And so I do think federal government should have pots of money. If they don't want to call it reparations, they don't have to, but I think we could justify why it would be reparations money. I think municipalities, I think some exploitative businesses, we could even, demand pots of money to go to this. I think there's enough people right now, that we have enough people creating curricula for various groups, that we have the information, right? It's a matter of making it available and figuring out ways to get it to people in a way that's helpful to them, so that they can then create co-ops first to address very immediate needs, and then, to expand. Again, I believe in a co-op commonwealth, so I think we should be expanding all our businesses to co-ops. So we could certainly start with places where markets have failed us and we don't have any activity or any services or goods that we need, and then eventually build into converting all the businesses we have. How's that for an answer, Cliff?
Wonderful, wonderful. But it makes me
Trying to say
wonder.
something too. Yeah.
It makes me wonder if with the Biden administration looking now toward a major infrastructure funding bill, whether there would be money there that could be used to promote formation of cooperatives, or even a cooperative bank, or bank to finance cooperatives.
I'd like to
Yeah.
say something. I think Mexico is ripe for cooperatives. The minimum wage is so minimal, you can't live on it. We have so many artisans. There's a group of women in a nearby town that they do rug hooking, and it's kind of a quasi co-op, but I just don't know why it hasn't caught on here. Maybe because there's no spark. Laura?
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, I have seen presentations where there are co-ops in Mexico, but why aren't there more, right? I always wonder, why aren't there more in the US either? And, in the US, and maybe not as much in Mexico, there's a bunch of issues. One of the issues in the US is that, we're a hegemonic capitalist country. And so it's hard to even talk about alternatives, right? That's partly why, even the history, the stories that I learned, it was so hard. It took me years to learn all the stuff I put in my book, because most of the stories were hidden. People didn't talk about them, because if you did, you were labeled a socialist or a communist, you were blacklisted, you were, spied on, you were harmed. And so it was really hard just to get the information out. Then the stories that were told were often told of failure, because that's, even if we're allowed to talk about them, you focus on the failure without realizing that a lot of the failure was the sabotage, right? So often people tell the story of failure as if we didn't know how to do it. I mean, for the first 10 years I was talking to Black communities about this, most of the time people said, oh, Black people don't know how to, we don't cooperate, we don't know how to cooperate. So either they didn't want to be marginalized any further, or they didn't really understand, and then when I would show them examples and talk about cooperation in our everyday life, then they would be like, oh yeah, you're right, we do cooperate, we do know how. But, but getting over those hurdles, I don't know the history of Mexico as much, but it's possible that, we don't teach those models in schools. They probably don't in Mexico either. So people don't automatically think of the alternatives. I mean, Mexico is still basically a capitalist society. Maybe it's a little bit more social democratic than US, but right, it still basically thinks that it has to thrive on individual initiative and private property. And so I think those things get in the way. I also believe, not just in education, but I think we should be helping our young people to start co-ops, because I think that's a way to get it permeating, right? Because families want to support their children in doing things, and then the children start to learn how to do it, and they realize they can have real businesses this way. So I think that's another kind of way to think about, right? If we promote youth co-op development, I think that could also sort of start trickling up. But I do think a lot of it is counteracting, right, the narratives that are already out there about failures, about what's a good business strategy and what's not, right? There's a lot of there's a lot of false mythology about economic democracy, that it's so slow and cumbersome and inefficient when it doesn't have to be, right? It's all about training people how to make decisions together, right? But if we don't train people to do that, then of course it's going to be cumbersome, right? If we don't train people on how to deal with conflict resolution and how to transform conflict, right, then of course conflicts will get in the way and people won't be able to make decisions in the way that they should, right? So there's a lot of sort of the negative mythology that also gets in the way, but we could get around it.
Thanks.
One of the things in Mexico that you would think would be very conducive to the formation of cooperatives is the ejido land system,
Right.
where communities collectively own the land. Generally, they don't use it cooperatively. They divide it up into different fields, and and each member of the community cultivates it as if it were their private land, even though they don't own it. It's usufruct. But at least you have the collective ownership that
Right.
you would think would be conducive to it, and in some cases have led to the formation of cooperatives. We have studied one. In fact, the Center for Global Justice did a documentary
Yeah,
film,
that great movie, right?
on a cooperative in the state of Hidalgo that was very well suited for the development of a resort. And so they developed it as a collective resort. It's been very successful. And I understand there are more around.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly don't know that much about Mexican history, but I also imagine that Mexico probably suffers from, the long hand of the US and the IMF, right? And the US and the IMF are not supportive of these kind of things, right? So I'm sure that any role the outside world plays, also would hamper these activities, but that doesn't mean that, Mexico shouldn't be trying to do it, right?
Well, yeah, actually, one of the conditions for Mexico to go into NAFTA that the US required was that they amend the Constitution to allow for the privatization of ejido land. And so a lot of the best land has been privatized.
Already, yeah.
But in addition to that, there's the mentality of the campesinos, and this is where your emphasis on education is important. We worked with a community near San Miguel and encouraged them to form a co-op, and because they had not disbanded the ejido, and they agreed to do so, but in fact they did not know how to function together. They
Right.
did not know how to make decisions. They wouldn't even come to meetings. And so it just sort of fizzled out.
Right. So that's why I say, some of the first steps are really to just start getting used to meeting together, talking things out, learning together, because that will go a long way toward having a co-op work and figuring out the right kind of co-op for that group. Right. And it's not that hard. I mean, it's hard in the sense of if people aren't used to meeting together, but it's not that hard if you can figure out a way to get people to start to meet, right? They start, I think people start to get used to then working things out together, talking together, meeting together. You can make it partly social, partly economic, whatever. And sometimes that really, it's just that simple a start can kind of propel things. But also, I also went to a meeting in Mexico City where some of the unions were really promoting co-ops.
Mhm, mhm.
So that's another place. The US has started to do that too, though with limited success. But the unions that have been interested, they've been able to really help because they also have some money. They usually have the health care so that some of the co-ops, you get a leg up by, being started by or being unionized. You don't have to, the co-op doesn't have to solve everything and do everything by itself. So that's also another interesting way to start with that partnership.
Well, you have to come to San Miguel and explore the cooperative movement from through the resources that the Center for Global Justice has become aware of.
Sounds great.
Are there any other questions lurking in the background anywhere?
Not anymore here in the Q&A.
Okay.
What I would like to do is promote next week before we close.
Yes.
And
we'll
then
do-
Cliff, you can close and thank. Next week, we're having a talk by Joanna Karthowski on food security, climate change, and the role of the Inuit women in the Canadian Arctic. We talk about honoring the struggles and successes of women around the world, and this year we're really doing it because of Zoom. It's possible. Thank you, Jessica. I'll let Cliff thank you also.
Well, yes, I want to give a special thanks to Jessica. Haven't seen you for several years, and it's great to see you again and to learn from you the results of your really path-breaking and very rich research. Um, I certainly enjoyed it, and I'm sure that our audience did as well. So
Thanks so much.
thank you again.
And they can go to globaljusticecenter.org to see a video of this very program.
All previous webinars have also been copied and are available on our website. So if you missed any, check them out. In closing, I do want to give a word of thanks to the team that puts these webinars together. There's Liz Mestras, there's Gregory Diamant, Roberto Robles, Olivia Canales, yours truly, and Trish Snyder has certainly played an important role in this month's webinars focusing on women.
And
Thank you to one
for
and
the
all.
interpreter as well, Laurie Terry. Okay.
All right,
Thank you all. Okay.
signing off.
Thanks. Bye-bye.